in some way leaving feeling a little bit beat up. Like we aren't serving enough. Like we look out and we go, wow, I don't have the mind of Christ. I don't serve in the way I can. I'm not doing the best I can. And it's probably because we don't look at our lives and we're not involved in everything. But the key, I think, to effective service as a part of a body of Christ is not doing everything. We can't, as humans, we can't serve in every possible capacity. There are so many needs in any congregation that no single individual can fill every single need. And so the key to effective service is not doing everything. It's finding that one or two or three things that we can do effectively. It's finding those few things that we have, those few needs that we have a unique gift or talent for, and then filling those needs to serve others. And when I look at the early church there in the book of Acts, I see a lot of stories of men and women who had different gifts and had different abilities and had different opportunities, but they all used those gifts and talents and abilities and opportunities to serve the kingdom in the way they could, when they could. Sure, they weren't apostles. They didn't go on any long missionary journeys. They didn't preach at Pentecost. They didn't write books of the Bible. They were normal, everyday disciples. People just like you and me who did incredible work and played an important part in the growth of the early church. I think that tells us something. That as we look at the early church there in the book of Acts and we think about what the early church did that made them so successful, I think it tells us that every member makes a difference. And that hasn't changed. So much incredible work is done today by men and women who are just doing their very best to serve God and to serve others. I've been encouraged by your work, and I know so many others here have been encouraged and been helped by the work of so many servants that are part of this church family. And so today I just want to look at five types of servants that every church needs. And my hope and my goal is that as we go through these types of servants that every church needs, that we'll identify one type of service that maybe we're not doing, but maybe that we can do. And so maybe we'll learn and be challenged to grow in our service to God. There in the book of Acts will be our name text. We're going to be in the book of Acts the entire time tonight. The book of Acts picks up where Luke drops off. That Jesus has died, Jesus has been buried, Jesus has been raised from the dead, and Jesus' final words to the disciples were pretty clear. Stay in Jerusalem until the Spirit comes. And that's what they did. They stayed in Jerusalem, and they waited, and they waited, and they waited. But they also gathered in the upper room, and in Acts 1 verse 14, it tells us there in the text that they were all continually united in prayer, along with the women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. Imagine for a second being there in Jerusalem. You've seen the resurrected Jesus. You've heard his teaching. And now you're crammed in this upper room with 120 other disciples. You have some questions. What is this Spirit? What does it mean? You maybe have some questions about the kingdom and the nature of the kingdom, but you also know that you can pray, and you know that God answers prayer, so you pray and you don't stop praying. They're continually, verse 14, united in prayer. And I wonder if the same could be said for us. If someone was writing the Acts of the Church of Deep East Texas, could someone say the church in Deep East Texas was continually united in prayer? And so right off the back there in Acts chapter 1, we see that the early church had some praying servants. Those were the first types of servants we're going to look at tonight. And when we look at the early church, that prayer was part of the life of the church there in Acts. Every time we turn around, they're praying. Things going good? Guess what they're doing? They're praying. If things are going bad and they're being persecuted and they're trying to hide from the Roman authorities and from the Jewish authorities and things aren't looking too great, guess what they're doing? They're praying. And if we zoom out and look at like the entire book of Acts as a whole, like all 28 chapters like we did in our back classrooms up until like a couple weeks ago, it's hard to separate the growth of the early church from the prayers of the early church. Just look at Acts chapter 2 and verse 42. This is right at Pentecost, and Peter has baptized, and the apostles have baptized 3,000 individuals. And there in Acts chapter 2 and verse 42, it says that they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. That's pretty good. To the fellowship, to being around one another and worshiping God, to the breaking of bread, into prayer. And look what happens there in Acts chapter 2 and verse 47. That they're praising God and they're enjoying the favor of all the people, and every day the Lord was adding to their number those who were being saved. They prayed, the church grows. But that's just one example. Just a couple chapters later in Acts chapter 6, there's a conflict, there's a problem there in the early church. And so the apostles in the early church, they're kind of wrestling, what should we do? And so the apostles appoint 6 men, 6 servants, we would call them almost kind of like deacons, to serve in a special capacity. And they had them in verse 6, stand before the apostles who prayed and laid their hands on them. Once again, we see pray. There's a conflict, there's prayer, there's a solution to the conflict, and there's prayer. And then in verse 7, look what happens. So the word of the God spread, and the disciples in Jerusalem increased greatly in number. And a large group of priests became obedient to the faith. The early church knew, they realized that prayer is not a last-ditch effort. It's not wishful thinking. That they knew, they understood that prayer is an act of faith and trust in an all-powerful God. They knew that if they prayed to God, that God would give the growth, because God can do exceedingly more than we ask or think. You see, the church needs men and women, righteous men and women, who are devoted to prayer. Men and women who are willing to pray for the sick, men and women who are willing to pray for their church leaders, men and women to pray that the gospel may spread. They need to pray because the effective prayer of a righteous man can accomplish great things. And I think we all can say that we can all pray maybe a little bit better, a little bit more. We can all improve in our prayer life, especially in looking for opportunities for the gospel to spread. But by the time we get to Acts chapter 9, the church has been around for a few years, and there's this woman there in Acts chapter 9 named Tabitha. You may also know her as Dorcas, and she lives in this coastal town named Joppa. And there in verse 36, it tells us that she was always doing good works and acts of charity. Today, we would kind of describe her as a Proverbs 31 woman. That she looked around her house and she realized she had a bunch of stuff and she had some skills. And so she used those skills and those abilities and those talents to serve in the way that she could. She was a skillful servant. And every church needs men and women like Tabitha. They need members who have the ability to cook a meal. They need members who have the ability to mend clothes or to even make clothes. They need men and women who have the ability to fix things around the house. And my guess is we've all benefited from a Tabitha at some point in our life. They brought food when we were sick. They fixed something when something was broken. Church families need skillful servants. They need men and women who are willing to do so many things that often go unnoticed, but make such a big difference in our lives. And Tabitha made a big difference there in the church. But the text tells us in verse 37 that she became sick. So sick that she ended up dying. And everyone is heartbroken. They've lost this great servant of the church. And so they wash her body and prepare her for burial, but they also hear that Peter's nearby. And so they call for Peter. And Peter comes, and as we're going to find out, she is raised from the dead. But what's interesting is when Peter arrives on the scene there in verse 39, that all these women come to Peter, and they show Peter the robes and the garments that Tabitha had made. I mean, can you imagine that being your legacy? That people are gathered at your funeral and they're like, here's the crock pot of casserole they made for me when they were alive. Here's this quilt. Here's this shirt or these pants that they mended when they were alive. Here's this appliance. Here's this microwave that they fixed 50 years ago. Can you imagine that being your legacy? A legacy of using your skills to serve others. That's what we see here with Tabitha. But as I think about Acts chapter 9 and Tabitha's example there in Acts chapter 9, I can't help but wonder what it had been like to be a part of that church family. Like maybe you're a young woman and you're on your way to church that day and you look down and maybe your dress is kind of old and maybe it doesn't fit quite right and your shoes are kind of not the best. And you're like, I really could use some new shoes. I really could use a new dress or skirt or robe or whatever women wear back then. And you get there and there's Tabitha at the door going, here's your new dress. Here's you some new robes. Like, how would that make you feel? Loved, encouraged, appreciated. You see, skillful servants have the ability to show love in ways that some of us can't. They play a vital role in the early church. And the great thing about being a part of the body of Christ is not just the things that go inside these four walls. It's the things that go on outside the four walls. The opportunity to serve one another and to be served. So I can't help but ask, what kind of skills, what kind of abilities do I have to serve others? Maybe you're one of those that has the ability to fix everything. Like you've got the Craftsman toolbox that you got at Lowe's and you have, it's that massive. Maybe you can fix anything and everything. Well, use that skill, use that ability to fix things. Maybe you have the ability to cook and can provide food for the sick and needy. If that's the case, then cook. Provide food for the sick and needy. It doesn't matter who we are. We all have skills. We all have abilities that we can use to serve others. But by Acts chapter 16, we see a third type of servant, and that's the generous servant. There in Acts chapter 16, Paul's on his second missionary journey. He gets to the city called Philippi. And Philippi was a leading city in that area. And they get there and they wait several days. And on the Sabbath day, he goes to a river and he meets this godly woman named Lydia. And Lydia was a seller of purple. She owned this business. And so she's probably a fairly wealthy woman because purple was so incredibly expensive in the ancient world. And when they're down by the river and Paul preaches the gospel, she responds. She's baptized. She becomes a part of the church family. But she doesn't stop there. There in verse 15, after hearing the gospel, in verse 15, she and her household were baptized, and she urged Paul and his companions, if you consider me a believer in the Lord, come and stay at my house. This is not hey, if you got nowhere to sleep, come on over. Okay, it's not. She's like, Paul, no, you're not going to stay at the Holiday Inn. You're coming to my house. You're going to get a nice hot breakfast. You're going to get a nice dinner. I'm going to take good care of you. She had these funds. She had this house. She had all these physical blessings, and she was going to use those physical blessings to serve Paul and his companions. And we need servants like Lydia today. Men and women who are willing to open up their heart in their homes to serve their brothers and sisters in Christ. Men and women who use their blessings to be a blessing. I remember when I was in college in Kentucky, the church I was at this time, fairly large church. It was probably 250 or 300. But the Sunday night before finals week, they had everybody over to one individual's house, and you went in and they had finger foods and like all sorts of foods for the college kids. But not just that, like there was this boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of like snacks and Little Debbie's and candy for the college kids for finals week. And they basically said, go through these boxes of Sam's Club size candies and snacks and grab as much as you want. The individual had pulled their resources and pulled their money to provide snacks for hungry college kids. And that was like 10, 15 years ago, and I still remember that, still made such an impact on me. Their generosity to go to that lengths every year, every semester really, to provide us some food and some snacks while we were in college. You know, churches need generous servants. Men and women who are willing to use their blessings to serve one another. And yes, that does include our weekly contribution that does get pulled together in our church treasury. But I think it's also about using our homes and our food and our time. Those are blessings too, to serve one another. God has given us so much. Are we using those blessings to serve and help others? And sometimes we do. But sometimes we don't. And this may be one of those areas that we can all improve on, looking for opportunities to use our homes and our blessings to serve those in need. Churches need all types of servants, but they especially need servants who have the knowledge and ability to teach and to correct. Churches need wise servants. And that's what we see there in Acts chapter 18. In Acts chapter 18, Priscilla and Aquila are in Ephesus, and they come across this guy named Apollos. And Apollos was super smart. There in the text, it tells us in verse 24, Acts 18 and verse 24, that Apollos is a native of Alexandria. He's an eloquent man who was competent, your translation may say, mighty in the use of the scriptures. And he arrives there in Ephesus. There's a couple of things we need to point out there. First, that he's from Alexandria. Now, Alexandria was in the ancient world what we would call today a college town. And not just a college town like, Nacogdoches or Huntsville or anything like that. Great cities. It was a college town like Boston, where there were a high center of learning, because Boston has like MIT and Harvard and all those like Ivy League type schools. It was an Ivy League type town. That's what I'm trying to say. So this guy is super smart. He's been trained really well. He's eloquent. He's mighty. He's competent in the scriptures. This guy knows his Bible really, really well. And he's even heard about Jesus, but there in verse 25. Yes, he's been instructed in the way of the Lord, being fervent in spirit. He was speaking and teaching accurately about Jesus, although he only knew John's baptism. He knew a lot, but he didn't have everything quite figured out. He only knows John's baptism. And so Priscilla and Aquila come across Apollos, this brilliant guy, and they take him aside and they explain the way of God more accurately. Two things come to mind as I look at Priscilla and Aquila and how they treated Apollos. One, Apollos must have been a really humble guy too. Because here are these people who didn't grow up in Alexandria, who don't have the Ivy League education, if I can use that term. And they correct him, and he accepts their correction. But two, how smart were Priscilla and Aquila, how mighty in the scriptures were Priscilla and Aquila to be able to correct Apollos there in the text. And how many times in our life have we benefited from a Priscilla and Aquila? That older man or that older woman or that student of the scriptures who's come alongside us and shared some really practical wisdom from the scriptures that has changed our life. And the beautiful thing about being a part of a church family is that there are usually some members who are extensively wise. They know their Bibles inside and out. They're the ones that you call at like 5 o'clock on a Wednesday when you've gotten sick and you can't teach your Bible class. They're the ones that always have that insightful comment in Bible class. They're the ones that we turn to when we have that really difficult question and we need some advice. The church needs men and women who have a knowledge of the truth, but not only that, but the experience to accurately teach the word of truth, to guide us and direct us in our walk with Christ. I know, look at my life, and I know it's the same with you, that you've had a couple of people along your life's journey who have been so impactful for you, who have helped you and transformed you in your service to God by providing some really practical Bible-based wisdom. And maybe you're like Priscilla and Aquila. Maybe you fill that niche here at Union Road. You're that wise servant. You have the ability to communicate and to share practical Bible-based wisdom. And if that's the case, then continue to study, continue to grow, continue to share what you have learned with the rest of us. You help us grow. But the final servant is the unnamed servant. We see that unnamed servant really in Acts chapter 8 at the first time. You see, when we look at the book of Acts, so much of our time and so much of our energy is spent on those big events, those like Pentecost or those big names like Peter and Paul. But so much great work in the book of Acts is done by unnamed servants. Average Joes who's just served Jesus in the best way they could, who were constantly telling everyone about Jesus. They didn't make the front page of the Jerusalem Times, but they still served and did the best they could to tell others about Jesus. And that's what we see there in Acts chapter 8 and verse 4. It says there in Acts chapter 8 and verse 4 that, so those, not the apostles, those there in Acts chapter 8 verse 4 contextually are just random disciples. So those who were scattered went on their way preaching the word. Stephen has been killed, he's been stoned, and now these average Joe disciples are going everywhere and they're taking the gospel with them everywhere. And just a few chapters later, there in Acts chapter 11, now those who have been scattered, the ones in Acts at chapter 8 and verse 4, as a result of the persecution that started because of Stephen, made their way as far as Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch, speaking the word to no one except Jews. These disciples had made their way all the way to Antioch. We're going to talk about that in a second. They're making great progress. Their kingdom is growing. People are coming to Christ. But then there were some of them, some of those who were scattered, men from Cyprus and Cyrene who came to Antioch and began speaking to the Greeks also and proclaiming the good news about Jesus. It was average Joes that shared the gospel with the Greeks there in Antioch. Unnamed servants laid the foundation for the gospel to spread to the Gentiles in Antioch. Think about what's going on there in the overall story of Acts as we've studied in the back classroom. The disciples, they're being persecuted. They've been forced out of town. They're running for their lives. And they finally make it to Antioch. And Antioch's like the third largest city in the ancient world. It's a city filled with pagan temples. And these unknown disciples, what are they doing? Well, they tell others about Jesus. They had a message to share, and they weren't going to stop sharing it. And their example is encouraging. Because even today, we put so much time and attention, and we get so distracted by the big names and the big events that so much good work goes unnoticed. So much incredible things happen when ordinary, everyday disciples do their best to serve God and tell others about Jesus. And I think we can learn a thing or two from the early church, that some of the most effective workers in the kingdom aren't the big names. They're just normal disciples who are doing their best to tell others about Jesus everywhere they go. And sometimes all it takes is just simply sharing our story, sharing about how God has influenced us, how Christ has changed our lives. That's just one way we can share the gospel. It's one way we can serve the church. Can't help but wonder what would happen if we all knew our gifts and our talents, and we all knew how to use them to serve the church. Would that help us serve with more zeal and more boldness and more passion? I think so, but that's just my opinion. You see, the key to doing the work in the kingdom is not doing everything. It's finding a few things that you can do. So look for ways for all of us to serve, because every member makes a difference. And that also means that every work, every service is valuable. That the woman who teaches the cradle roll class is just as valuable as the man who teaches the auditorium. That the one who announces the sick is just as important as the lady who writes cards to the sick. That the one who shares the gospel in private is just as important as the one who preaches the gospel in the pulpit. Every work, every service is valuable. We all play a part. We all have a work to do. We all have something we can do to serve the kingdom. And so the question for all of us is, are we? Are we using the gifts and the talents and abilities that we've been given to serve the kingdom? Are we letting our gifts and our talents go to waste? Are we maximizing our gifts for the glory of God, or are we hiding them under a bushel? What are we doing? If you'd like to renew your service to God, recommit your life, start a life anew of serving Him, we would love to help you with that. We can help find a place for you to serve in this kingdom, in this place. If we can help you with that, please let us know while together we stand and sing.